Yeah. First of all, I want to thank the projectionist. I know it was very difficult to screen these films in this way, so thank you. What's pleasure for us is hard work for someone else. This will be just a short introduction to, well, you've just seen now a couple of examples from our films, and I will give you some examples, a short introduction of some of the activities we do in the museum, some of the research plans that we have. And if anybody has, if I talk too fast or something, or anybody has difficulty with my English, please ask so. I would like to ask, could that light perhaps be a bit more down? It's right in my face. It's even more. Okay. It's that one. I can't see. Okay, yeah, thank you very much. The opening film of the program you've seen, the Taak der Corrida, may have been a little unsettling. If that was indeed the case, I'm not going to apologize. On the contrary, I'm glad. I'm glad it was because it was purposefully programmed to make you feel a little uncomfortable. The film's suddenness, its incompleteness, its discontinuity, its lack of clarity. Is it fiction? Is it non-fiction? Is it both? Make it, I think, into a suitable introduction to early documentary. And furthermore, the film could also more or less be seen as reflecting our own experience at the Nederlands Filmmuseum and how these prints took us by surprise as well. When you only know early non-fiction from film history books, or when you only know early non-fiction from other films or television programs, usually in the form of clips and fragments, usually always the same clips and fragments, you're quite unprepared for the material in an archive, in a film archive. To approach film history by way of a film archive is a confrontation, therefore. Confrontation with your expectations about, for instance, the diversity of early documentary, as you might have thought that most of these films only deal with subjects that are found worthy of being documented. Official things such as warfare and military spectacle, or ceremonies involving royalty and statesmen. Incidentally, the film you saw, Die Weltreise unserer Kronprinzen, it's interesting that precisely the official parts of that film were removed. What you saw was an incomplete print, and the only thing that you saw were street scenes. Straßenbilder is what is the official term. A confrontation also with expectations about the nature of early documentary. As you might have thought, that film is either fictional or non-fictional, and that the two can always be clearly distinguished. But when you look at Nature's Fairest, the flower film, or The Lobster, the comedy with, what you call it in German? The lobster? You see that it's not always so easy to distinguish between the two, or that films can mix both fictional and non-fictional elements. It can also be a confrontation with expectations about the way documentaries present their subjects. As you might have thought, there always is a subject. But when you look at waterfalls, for instance, the last film you saw, is that just about waterfalls? I'm not sure. It's something also, but besides that you see water, it becomes also much more and more abstract, and it always makes you feel dizzy. I mean, I saw this film standing up, and that's much more difficult when you're sitting down. It's a kinetic experience, as they call it. Or you might have thought too that there's always an argument or a point to be made in early documentary. But when you look at travelogues, there's no point at all. It's just a movement through landscape. More generally, working in an archive can also be a confrontation with your expectations about what a film print looks like. As you might have thought that film prints are always neat and complete, or that the prints of a given title are identical. History books and television screenings never tell you how uncommon that is. On the contrary, in an archive you will find how many changes and damage a print may have undergone on its journey through time. As a result of its screening in cinemas, sometimes people thought films were too long, so they cut parts of it. Because of the colors that were added, because of intertitles that were added, or they may differ because of censorship. And there are many more examples of that. And you will realize that anybody who says that he has seen, for instance, Metropolis or Nanook of the North, to name a few known examples, everybody who says he has seen these films is in a sense telling a lie. That is, or at least he's not telling enough, because it's likely that no two prints of these films will ever be the same. Okay, but after the initial shock of this confrontation has subsided, viewing early documentary may also become an adventure, a trip full of surprises. And that's why I wanted to show you these films in their entirety, rather than clips or fragments of them. Clips and fragments are usually made to illustrate one's speech and to fit one's speech, and that's what makes them such ideal illustrations. Here, however, one could say that the inverse situation is the case. It's my introduction that serves as a kind of illustration, a kind of comment on the films you've just seen. It's a bit like the small signs you see under paintings in a museum. In fact, it's hard to talk about early documentary without screening it, as not much other information is available yet. I was told that the audience of this conference was largely a non-specialist audience. That, I think, is almost a tautological term, eine tautologie, because in the case of early documentary, it's pretty safe to say there is no specialist audience. It's much too early for that. Why is that so? Well, first of all, there's hardly an opportunity to see early non-fiction, apart from conferences like this or the occasional festival. And even if film archives would massively preserve early non-fiction, which is not the case, it's not likely that these films would be shown on a regular basis. That may have something to do with the fact that it would probably require more work. Non-fiction is not readily associated with an evening's entertainment, with going to the movies. Attractive presentational forms have to be found in which these films can be shown to advantage. That's something that we try to do in the Nederlands Filmmuseum in Amsterdam. To give two examples, this year we had a 2-month program of expedition films. The museum has a large collection of expedition films to the North and South Pole, to the Himalaya, the heart of Africa, films like that. And for each of these films, we made a separate score, was executed live. Another example to give non-fiction its place in a cinema is what is happening now in the museum, because we reconstructed a program from the 19-teens. So there you can see it again amid all the other films that were shown in the program, amid the comedies and the melodramas, with live music, and with an explication and an Erklärung you call it, I believe. Another reason why it is too early to talk about a specialist audience is that early documentary has largely escaped the notice of film history or film studies. Several circumstances may account for this. For general film historical overviews, early documentary is largely a minority, eine Minderheit, both in terms of the number of titles produced and in the number of prints sold of each title. Usually these histories only deal with the period between roughly 1895 and 1905, when non-fiction dominated programs of film. And even then, domination is not a good word, because in many countries, especially the United States, in Holland, I think in Germany too, film shows were part of a larger variety program with singers and jugglers and whatever you have. Okay, but after 1905 or so, film history loses interest, as if in the following 15 or 20 years, nothing worthwhile was made. And actually, from a certain point of view, that seems indeed to be the case, because film history was, and perhaps still is, largely concerned with change and innovation, particularly in style, narration, and the development of film as an art form. So, as the fiction film, which began to dominate film programs after 1905, when fiction film underwent a series of rapid changes between 1905 and 1915, this type of film was a much more obvious object for study. In contrast, it appears that documentary films, which stem from a much longer tradition with roots in pre-cinema practices, such as magic lantern shows and illustrated lectures, it appears that documentary films are much more stable throughout the era of the silent cinema, at least until the early 1920s. That doesn't mean, of course, that that may be so, that their development was rather stable or there was no development at all. Doesn't mean, of course, that these films did not try to seduce the audience or move them. Many examples that you've seen here are not just about their subjects. Films like The Paper Factory in Italy, for instance. It's not only about making paper, it's also about how beautifully the light falls into this factory. Or the film about the Marines, also in Italy, it's the same thing. It's about light, but it's also about composition, especially the long shot with the boats. And it's also about how experienced these Marine men are working. So there's always more layers in one image. Okay. Non-fiction has also escaped notice because the normal commercial exhibition sites, such as fun fairs and variety theaters and cinema theaters. Documentary was also shown in other locations, in alternative circuits, and I'm only talking now about public screenings. So let's say outside the mainstream. Often these screenings occurred in an educational contexts, in schools, for instance, or in halls rented for one or more evenings by traveling lecturers, and they talk about life in the colonies or the behavior of bees, stuff like that. And as a matter of fact, talking about these alternative circuits, there's of course a parallel with today, where most of the documentary output is shown on television or even in other media. So if nowadays you would want to write a film history about documentary, it would never be complete. It cannot deal with the genre anymore. So, when a little under 10 years ago, the Film Museum, the Dutch Film Museum, set out on a rescue operation of its silent film collection, film history provided no answers to the problems that these films posed. And one could say, in a sense, that the films that you've just seen and others more or less rescued themselves by their beauty, their cruelty, their wonderment, their strangeness, and so on. The selection of prints for preservation, in particular the selection of the films you've just seen, was therefore largely a subjective affair. Any aspect of a film print could persuade one to preserve it, whether or not it was complete, whether or not decay began to eat away the images. One might ask then if the films that you've just seen are representative, although we cannot say with certainty that they are representative in terms of narration or style and the like. We assume that these films do represent a fair cross-section of what audiences must have seen at the time. In this case, we can be pretty sure of that, as a large part of our silent non-fiction collection was preserved from projection prints, that is, prints that were actually screened in cinema theaters at the time, mainly the early teens. And this consideration of the audience has influenced, in fact, many areas within the Film Museum, not only preservation itself. We have a word for that. Internally, we use the term cinema culture. So every film, or we try to be also representative of what happened in cinemas. Also foreign films, which were a huge success in Holland, like films that were running for 50 weeks or so, we preserved because that was part of our cinema culture. It also influences this notion of the audience. Our programming activities, like I just said, that we reconstruct programs from earlier decades, the program from the teens we also are doing a program from the 30s and the 50s and so on. And of course it had also influenced our research projects. Because in research, we try to capitalize on the fact that we have so many incomplete, damaged, or just strange prints. And that enables us to favor the point of view of the spectator. What did he see? How were the films presented? We assume, moreover, that innovation was a negligible consideration for contemporary audiences. They were, I think, interested in new films every week, even twice a week if possible. Okay. So the fact that established film history cannot account for documentary filmmaking for a period of almost 20 years in the beginning of this century, or for its exhibition outside the commercial venues, shows the need for this kind of approach, an approach which starts with the audience and starts within the cinema. And perhaps it may also be a reason to have a whole series of such new approaches, multiple film histories, each with a different scope, with different objects, with different entities, each answering different questions. For instance, in documentary, it may well be the case that it might well be necessary to go further back than 1895. As I said, there's a whole long tradition in Magic Lantern shows, so the fact that these documentaries were on film is in a sense an accidental aspect of them. Okay. One such way of approaching early non-fiction, or perhaps even silent cinema in general, would favor not the individual film, but the complete program, of which each of the films you've seen were a part. In programming, subject and mood and function become at least equally important as style narration, because exhibitors usually try to reach some kind of balance between humorous, moving, and educational elements. A program is not just a series of films, one behind the other. It's a show. It plays with the films. It plays with color. It plays with live music and Erklärung. As a result of programming, of balancing the program, the distinction between fiction and non-fiction may have been less relevant than we think it is today. Even the most factual of genres, the newsreel, often contained comic or otherwise near-fictional items. Look, for instance, at the actresses in the fashion item. In fact, newsreels show in miniature, as it were, how pervasive this desire for balance was. This may also explain why newsreels were so often and so conspicuously mixed with other items of other newsreels. You can actually say there's hardly any newsreel which can be called an original. Compilation was a standard practice. In other genres, we can see this balance too, like in the Travelogue about Bangkok, which is a veritable mini program containing a whole sample of documentary genres, including a more comical or lighter item, the man juggling with the balls. It's almost a variety act. In fact, there are many, I call them documentaries too, there are many films made of variety acts, of jugglers and acrobats, stuff like that. And even in longer documentaries of the time, such as the film of the pole expeditions, the ones of Shackleton, for instance, or Robert Scott, pure expedition scenes are also alternated, for instance, with wildlife shots to make the film more variable. And especially in I think it is the film about the Robert Scott expedition, there the penguins provide comic relief, and in the intertitles of this film, one penguin is actually called Charlie Chaplin. Well, in order not to take up too much time, I would like to end with one particular example of why an emphasis on everyday cinema-going experience of the audience could be important. It could throw a different light on things. Because this kind of approach can sometimes provide an alternative or a competing interpretation of phenomena that are usually seen in terms of stylistic or narrational developments. If you have seen Louise Buñuel's L'Âge d'Or, The Golden Age, you may perhaps remember that it opens with footage taken from a wildlife documentary. In this sequence, we see a battle between two scorpions and a rat. Usually, this sequence is interpreted in terms of the film's theme, or in terms of its social criticism, or in terms of its avant-garde style, and I won't be surprised if there would be a completely Freudian interpretation as well. Nevertheless, despite all these interpretations, you often read or hear that the sequence is considered to be difficult or mysterious even. One commentator wrote that If it were not for the intertitle in this sequence, he wouldn't have understood this wildlife sequence. However, in terms of audience experience, the sequence is perfectly normal and straightforward. And all of a sudden, the strangeness of the film disappears. Instead of being shocking, instead of shocking or mystifying the audience, the opening of the film links up with everyday film-going experiences. Wildlife documentaries were standard ingredients of film shows throughout the teens and the 20s. Indeed, they often opened the program. In fact, the shock of this sequence only comes when the film suddenly changes course after a while, and all of a sudden the spectator seems to land in a totally different film. Although one could also argue that even that is an experience which is not uncommon when films were shown in programs, where you were taken from one subject, from one mood to another. So you see that early documentary was able to make an audience feel comfortable as well. Thank you.
Ja, wir haben wieder noch ein bisschen Zeit und setzen uns noch da oben hin für Fragen. Ja, also wir haben jetzt ein doppeltes Sprachproblem. Es wird, glaube ich, keins sein. Also Nico de Klerk versteht, wie gesagt, Deutsch, wenn langsam gesprochen wird. Er wird in Englisch antworten, was Sie hoffentlich verstehen. Allerdings unsere russischen Gäste nicht so. Deshalb werde ich das dann immer so ein bisschen wiederholen. Aber ich denke, wir werden schon zurechtkommen. Eine Bemerkung möchte ich gleich zum Anfang machen. Ich war dir sehr dankbar für den Satz, dass es ein spezialisiertes Publikum für diese Filme noch nicht gibt, noch nicht geben kann. Dazu ist es zu früh. Das heißt für uns alle, dass wir ganz offen jetzt hier alle sagen können, was uns einfällt. Denn die Spezialisten gibt es offensichtlich noch nicht. Das sagt selbst Nico de Klerk. Ein paar Punkte möchte ich rausgreifen, die du erwähnt hast. Vielleicht gleich mit dem ersten ganz schwierigen Begriff, der uns hier alle begleitet. Du hast angefangen zu sagen, ja, der Dokumentarfilm als Begriff wird schon herausgefordert in der Arbeit, die wir im Archiv haben, denn wir fragen uns erstmal, was ist ein Film und dann auch noch, was ist das Dokumentarische daran? Ich möchte jetzt auf dieses Film kurz eingehen, was du mir vorhin erzählt hast. Ihr sammelt nicht nur ganze Filme, sondern ihr sammelt auch Teile von Filmen. Ist das richtig? Ihr sammelt kleine Ausschnitte, wo ihr nicht wisst, wo gehören sie hin. Und was ist jetzt sozusagen, wo fangt ihr an Filme, wo sind es Momente? Welche Schwierigkeiten habt ihr damit?
Actually, no difficulties at all. Now, when a little under, as I told, a little under 10 years ago, we started out on a rescue operation of the nitrate collection, especially of the silent era. And often we were very surprised to find these short fragments of film. We call them also bits and pieces, as you saw on the screen. Nobody knows from which films they came. Nobody knows what they are, whether they're a documentary or not. We just preserve them because we like them. That's actually the only reason why they were preserved. As with so many films, because there's hardly one film that you've seen just now which is complete.
How many bits and pieces do you have?
About 300.
And you know them all, but you're the only one.
No, I don't know them all. And there are many sound bits and pieces as well. Yes.
So where do you get them from? Oh, wir reden Englisch, Entschuldigung. Es gibt auch Ton-Bits and Pieces. Wo haben Sie die gefunden?
By opening cans, it's just there. That's
aber
sometimes so incredible.
Die passen nicht zu den Filmen natürlich.
Sorry?
Wie werden dann die Tondokumente vorgeführt? Die passen nicht zu den Filmen.
The same. I mean, we make compilations of bits and pieces with only sound films. And, well, you go from one type of sound to the other.
Oh, I see. Okay. Das Dokumentarische daran, hast du vorhin angesprochen, wird problematisch bei solchen Filmen wie, oder was heißt problematisch, fällt auf bei solchen Filmen wie die Blumeneinstellung. Und da hast du einen Begriff des Dokumentarischen zitiert. Ich denke, ja, ob man das stehen lassen kann. Das Dokumentarische würde ja, hast du gesagt, oft mit einer Aussage verbunden, dass ein Film eine Aussage, ein Argument führt. Und das sei doch zumindest etwas, was bei diesen Blumeneinstellungen, bei den Natureinstellungen, die wirklich ein Bild haben, herausgefordert würde.
Could you translate the last part of the question?
So it's not a documentary in the sense that it's got a, like it's making a point, the film, it's just showing the picture. Right. Die Frage wäre jetzt, was aus dem, was du vom Programmieren erzählt hast, haben diese Filme für die Zuschauer bedeutet, wenn sie sozusagen in dem Kontext des Programms waren, so wie du das beschrieben hast?
I haven't found any actual responses, of course, in these films in papers or other sources. I do know that we have program notes where you see that these films were really screened. I think part of their attraction is their coloring. It's not, as indeed you said, it's not to make a point. It's just to make you enjoy these flowers. Sometimes it's not in this one, but in other flower films there's a kind of transformation at the end where a flower changes into a lady who is dressed up like a butterfly, things like that. So there's perhaps a relation with a type of film which is called the féerique films of transformation, trick films. But that's not only for these flower films. It's sometimes very hard to say what these films did, because that depends very much on where they were shown in a program, for instance. I've seen one of these flower films right after a melodrama, and then all of a sudden it becomes a very sad film. It's like almost flowers for a funeral. So, and that changes, I think, with which film went before it and which film comes after it.
In deiner Arbeit rekonstruierst du auch solche Programmaufläufe, ist das richtig?
Yes, not very authentic in the sense that we have all the films. Let's say we have paper program notes, and all the films mentioned there. We don't have all these films, but we can try to approach the programs as they were. But in fact, it's not so important to reconstruct the actual programs. It's much more important and much more interesting to look at what a program can do to films. Whatever, I mean, because there's always something happening when 10 films are put into one program. They influence each other. That's what I try to show with the comedy, because in the beginning, especially after you've seen say 5 or 6 documentaries, which is of course very unusual, but the beginning could have fooled you perhaps. It looks like a documentary almost. In this case, even I think the director deliberately tried to do that. He's a very sophisticated filmmaker. So you can never, I think what you have to say about these films, you cannot say one thing about them. It always changes. That's what I try to show here.
Das war jetzt das Programm, was du speziell für uns zusammengestellt hast. Vielleicht sind dazu jetzt Kommentare oder Anmerkungen zu dem, was wir eben gesehen haben. Es waren ja sehr wirklich unterschiedliche Filme. Gibt es dazu erste Eindrücke, was Sie gesehen haben? Ja.
Mich würde interessieren, ob es für bestimmte Filme, zum Beispiel für die Marine in Italien oder ähnliche, oder diese kolonialen Ausstopfungsszenen und so weiter, ob es da Auftraggeber gegeben hat. Oder ob das kann man sich schier nicht vorstellen, dass es private Liebhabereien waren, wie Blumen in den Alpen oder so etwas, sondern dass es da einen ganz bestimmte Intentionen und auch Zwecke gab.
I think there always was an Auftraggeber, is that the word? I don't know what it is in English actually. of course, always the production company itself, because, for instance, the Gaumont production company in France had a series of river films, so their cameramen were sent all over the country to shoot all these little rivers. I think in the case of the marine film, I don't know if there was if it was what you call that, commanded, I think, by the Navy. I guess so, because we know the name of the director, which is very unusual. You can also see that he must have been able to prepare awfully well, because he knows exactly where he has to stand with his camera to get the best shots and to see the process of what they're doing in its most from the most advantageous position. So I guess in this case, you can. I'm not sure, but you can. I think that it would have been commanded by the Navy, or at least that if it was a production company's idea, that they had to have the Zustimmung from the Navy. The same goes also for many films which were shot in the colonies. I know from films which were made by Dutch cameramen in the Dutch Indies, which is now called Indonesia, that was commanded by what we call a colonial institute. And they showed their films also not in commercial theaters, but in these alternative circuits for people who went to work in the colonies later on, so they would be informed about life and customs, etc.
Ja, mir wurde gesagt, wir haben nicht so viel Zeit, wie ich eigentlich dachte. Ja, Herr Nussbaum, bitte noch.
Warum ist eigentlich die Archivlage so schlecht bei diesem frühen Film? Es gibt, glaube ich, kaum ein Medium. Also an der zeitlichen Entfernung kann es nicht liegen. Wir haben für dieselbe Zeit in anderen Medien scheint mir eine wesentlich bessere Dokumentationslage. Also wie kommt es, dass der frühe Film so zerbröckelt ist als Medium? Weil er noch nicht als wirkliches Medium erkannt war oder weil er sozusagen zu unterschiedlich benutzt worden ist? Oder ist es nur eine temporäre Situation? Können wir sozusagen davon ausgehen, dass jetzt nach dieser Akzentuierung der Aufmerksamkeit in 20 Jahren eine wesentlich bessere Materiallage vorliegt, auch für diese sogenannt frühe Zeit?
Yeah. Well, I guess as I tried to explain that, first, no, let me talk about The Prince first. I mean, that goes for every kind of film, because not only the nitrate is the life of nitrate is very short. Films, when they were they were shown for a week, perhaps two in one cinema, then two. Well, they were released for a very short time, and after that they were destroyed to get out the silver emulsion again, stuff like that. So many films were thrown away. There are estimations that only 75% of the whole silent era has been kept. We were lucky because in our archive we have the films of a distributor from the early teens who could not throw anything away, nothing. Not even the films. So that's why we're luckier perhaps than other archives. About the way this kind of film is represented, I think, as I tried to explain, it has to do with the fact that fiction film had more interesting kinds of stylistic and narrational developments. That was the focus of film history. Film history focused until a couple of years ago mainly on change and innovation. So that's why I think these films were neglected. They were found uninteresting. And it's not a coincidence that with films like Nanook of the North, the interest came back, because these were narrative films in a sense. They were not just like a camera on a train going nowhere. I mean, this was a real story of Nanook of the North from A to B. I think these are one or two reasons for why these films are not represented.
Ja, also tatsächlich 75% sind nicht mehr erhalten. Also davon kann man wohl jetzt ausgehen. Ja, dann beschließen wir damit erstmal die Runde. Ich danke Ihnen herzlich, vor allem für die wunderbaren Filme und für das Gespräch, dass Sie mitgebracht haben, ausgesucht haben. Wir machen um 5 Uhr weiter mit den Gästen aus Russland, Dokumentarfilme aus dem Archiv in Krasnogorsk. Wir machen zwischendurch aber eine kleine Pause. Draußen gibt es auch Kaffee.